Good evening and welcome to our broadcast here. This is not live, but we welcome you in watching this show, wherever you are, whenever you decide to. We have with us our scholar in residence, Rabbi Manis Friedman, acclaimed author, social philosopher, and public speaker. I understand he is one of, maybe the most popular rabbi on social media. With his own site, It's Good to Know, many, literally hundreds of thousands of views, lectures, insights, offering guidance and inspiration to Jews and non-Jews around the world. The series is titled Spiritual Zone, a 5-part series covering primary character traits from a Jewish mystical perspective. And the subject tonight is am I cynical or just realistic? We thank you, Rabbi Friedman, once again for joining us and sharing your views and insights, which continue to fascinate so many. We have tonight with us Zachary Squire from New York City originally, spent a bit of time in London where I came to know him. We studied together here and there. And he's taken on this job, this challenge, this responsibility of interviewing and bringing the best out of Rabbi Manis Friedman on this subject tonight. So without further ado, Zachary, I hand it over to you and all yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Rabbi Friedman, for being here. So I guess to start it off or sort of set the table, the topic for tonight is really about, in terms of the different, I guess, character traits, or what exactly they are is actually something we'll get into, associated with the element of air. And so this is based on, I guess, a passage in the Tanya that we'll just pull up briefly. If I can put it up on the screen here. So this is, we're saying, and I'll be reading in translation, forgive me. Every Jew, whether righteous or wicked, possesses two souls. It's neshamot. And these are two nefashot, two souls and life forces. One soul originates in the kelipa and the sitra achara. It is this nefesh that is closed in the blood of a human being, given life to the body. As it is written, for the nefesh of the flesh is in the blood. From this nefesh stems all the evil characteristics deriving from the 4 elements within it, namely anger and pride from the element of fire, which rises upward, the appetite for pleasures from the element of water, for water promotes the growth of all kinds of pleasurable things, frivolity and scoffing, boasting and idle talk from the element of air, and sloth and melancholy from the element of earth. From this soul stems also the good traits inherent in every Jew's character, such as compassion and benevolence. So I think we can sort of pause there. And the focus today is going to be on this element of air, these character traits, or these issues related with the element of air. And so I guess the first question then is to help us get oriented, let's say, in the moral universe that this sets up. What exactly are these things? Frivolity, scoffing, boasting, and idle talk. Are they emotions? Are they passions? Are they habits? Are they actions? Are they dispositions? And are all of the things on this list sort of the same type? Or is this mixed together somehow? So that would be, I guess, the first question. And related to that, is this list sort of an exhaustive list of the negative qualities that human beings have, so that any type of negative quality could pretty much be boiled down to or categorized in one of the things listed here? Or is this just sort of some examples, but there are more, and there's some significance to that? So I'll let you kick it off from there.
Let's back up a little bit.
Sure.
One of the things that we're being introduced to is really a way of thinking, because there are 2 ways of pursuing understanding and knowledge. One is called hafshata, which means taking the concept out of its context and giving it a wider application. And the other is the opposite, called halbasha, where you take an idea that is very general and kind of vague, and you apply it in a very specific context. Here, the Rebbe is demonstrating how that which is concrete, like boasting or cynicism, has its source in something more abstract, less concrete. So if we want to trace things back to their source, it's always a process of elimination. Take away the details, take away the context, and get to the principle behind it all. And that principle is always more abstract. So the more abstract, the closer we're getting to the origins, to the essence, to the beginnings. Because everything begins in the abstract and then kind of devolves until it becomes concrete. But you can trace it because there's a theme behind it. So, for example, the Rebbe says the human soul has 4 elements, is made up of 4 elements. The elements that we're talking about here are not the same as the table of elements that the scientists talk about. The scientists are talking about substances, 102, 98, whatever they are at the given moment. We're talking about substances, essential substances. The Rebbe is talking about a much more abstract concept. The 4 elements are actually 4 movements or directions. Things can move up, things can move down, things can move in all directions, or things can resist all movement. That basically makes up everything that follows in creation. Because everything in creation is either a result of going up, or of going down, or of going everywhere, or of going nowhere. So anger, for example, the Rebbe says that comes from the element of fire. The element of fire means the tendency to rise. Anger rises, it flares up, as does arrogance. So arrogance can be traced to the nature of rising. Depression, on the other hand, and laziness, which element would you attribute it to? Fire, water, air, earth? Earth, the heaviest, that resists movement. So the lazy person can't move. The depressed person can't move. Now we come to the element of air, which is the one you want to talk about. What does the element of air produce when it devolves and becomes more concrete? The element of air can be described as indiscriminate. It will move in all directions. It doesn't have any one particular direction that it prefers. What character traits would that produce when it devolves? Well, it'll produce an airhead, a person who can go anywhere, any direction, anytime, for no particular reason. What do we call those character traits? Cynicism belongs to this category because cynicism has no position. It takes no position. It has no opinion. It does not want to limit itself to only one option. And so it's cynical. So whatever you say, the reaction is a cynical one. Well, maybe that, but then again, maybe not.
Right. So we could throw in skepticism, for instance, in the same category.
Yes.
So it seems then that this encompasses, I guess, sort of two sorts of different sets of characteristics, which some people might consider different. One is this idea of, like you said, airheadedness, frivolity, just sort of lightness, lack of engagement with anything serious or real. And the other is this idea of lack of commitment, almost, whether intellectual or perhaps emotional or personal, but someone who either can't commit personally or doesn't want to commit intellectually, and so has an attitude of skepticism, cynicism.
It's almost as if the Rebbe is giving examples in the mental, emotional, and behavioral areas.
Right.
So cynicism would be emotional, intellectual.
Right.
Sarcasm would be in the emotions. Boasting, which is an interesting.
I want to focus on that one in a bit, but please go on.
Yeah. Boasting would be in speech. And what is the other one there?
We have frivolity, scoffing, idle talk.
Right. So frivolity would be in behavior. Careless behavior, frivolous activities. So we're covering basically the entire totem pole of the human makeup. The mind, the emotions, the speech, and the actions.
So this is basically laying the big picture, saying whether you're talking about emotions, actions, predilections, habits, they all ultimately are related to each other, and all of the ones of this type spring from this element of air within the human soul. So I think cynicism is related to scoffing. So I think we can get a handle on scoffing in the sense of this perhaps not wanting to take a position, but scoffing and boasting in particular seem interesting here, because you mentioned previously that the quality of arrogance or haughtiness emanates from this element of fire. And most people, or many people, might associate the idea of boasting or scoffing with arrogance, with a sense of superiority, with pride, all of those related things. So in what sense then does this, is this related to an element of fire? Is the element of fire, how should we understand the relationship between the elements of air and fire on this, and sort of what the differences may be between things of this nature that are associated with fire and things that may be associated with
air? It's interesting that boasting and arrogance are considered two very different behaviors. Arrogance is a seriously held opinion, an inflated sense of importance. That can be damaging. It can be harmful. It can cause wars. You get two people who are arrogant, and there's going to be violence. Or as they say, it's not going to be pretty.
Right.
But boasting is harmless, because the person boasting does not really believe what he's saying.
I see. All right, so that's the important distinction. An arrogant person, I don't know what the term is, but sort of conveying to people verbally what they think about themselves is an honestly held opinion. What would we call that then if it's not boasting? Would it just be
the arrogant person, if he's intelligent, will never boast.
right? But he will if
Look
he
back.
makes comments that sort of display that he believes that he's superior to other people, or just has very excellent qualities, which he may sincerely believe. What do we call that if it's not boasting?
No, he may not boast at all. In fact, he may claim humility. Oh, no, I'm not that special. Doesn't matter. He looks down at everybody and he feels superior. He's got a superiority complex. Doesn't mean he has to say it. If
Right.
he's smart, he'll hide it.
All right. So
He'll try
interesting.
to hide it.
So this idea of boasting and scoffing comes from perhaps things you don't believe to be true. And in that sense, maybe a sense of insecurity, which we can also relate to this concept of air, because nothing is fixed and maybe you're sort of lacking any kind of grounding or confidence. Is that
Very good.
correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So the guy who boasts is putting up a wall, a facade that he knows is not true.
Right. So that's an interesting question that you raise, because it's sort of it's related to this idea of making claims that are not true. Nowhere on this list is actually listed out explicitly deception or lying, which is a very common, negative trait that people might consider. It seems like there's an element of that in boasting, but in this rubric of the four elements, where does deception, lying, dishonesty, being disingenuous, all these kind of related traits, how does that fit in? Help us understand that.
So that's another very interesting thing. None of these traits, none of them involve crime or sin.
Mm-hmm.
None of them are forbidden. So the Rebbe is carefully avoiding attributing any sinful activity to our nature, because he's describing our nature here. So we can naturally be arrogant. We're not naturally crooks. We're not naturally adulterers.
Right.
So he's avoiding anything that is sinful, because there you have the option. Freedom of choice. Sin or don't sin. But if you have the character of fire, you don't really have much of a choice. Especially if you're a redhead.
Right. And so does that imply then that lying or saying something that's untrue of any form is a sin? I mean,
Yes.
it's not, pardon me?
Yes.
Okay. So that's a clear line that we want to lay down. So being arrogant, not necessarily a sin.
No.
Scoffing, not necessarily a sin.
Right.
Lying, red line, no good.
Right.
So if the scoff or the boast then always has to come from something that you yourself don't believe to be true, how do we thread that needle of it kind of not falling into this category of sin? I mean, almost by definition, if you take that, you're putting forward something that you don't think is true. So isn't there a lie or a deception inherent in every scoff or every boast?
Yes. And yet it is not morally, it is not the same as lying, because as the boaster is boasting, he's assuming you know that he doesn't mean it. A guy says, I'm the best in the world at this. Come on, nobody believes that. It's just talk.
So what do we say? How do we characterize then talk of that nature, which people, even if they shouldn't believe it or if they should know better, do believe? You know, somebody says, I'm the best doctor in the universe, or, you know, I'm the smartest person in the history of the world. And people say, yeah, I think that's true, you know, which is these days a much more plausible scenario than you might have imagined it was 4 or 5 years ago. You know, I have the best words, I have the biggest vocabulary, I'm the healthiest person that there ever was. People believe that that's true sometimes. So where does that fall? And how does that relate to, I guess, the issue of morality, in the sense that part of the moral quality of that action would seem then to depend on how it's received by its audience, right? If you say one thing, if someone believes it's true, different than if they don't believe it's true, even though your action is the same.
Yeah. So that would apply, I guess, to arrogance as well. Isn't arrogance lying?
Well, if you sincerely believe it, maybe not. You know,
Correct. So if you're arrogant, your opinion about yourself is incorrect.
Right.
It's not sinful. It's just wrong. It's factually wrong. So lying would mean with the intent to deceive. But the guy who's boasting and somebody takes him seriously, his intention was not to deceive. His intention was to distract. Don't get to know who I really am. Let's just play this game. I'll pretend to be somebody I'm not, because I don't know what I am. So I'll just boast about stuff and we'll have a lot of fun. So it's escapist.
Right.
Entertainment.
This seems to be bad news for all the actors of the world. Pretending to be someone you're not is, you know, is actually seems to be bad. So what is the, so I mean, is there, we're veering off topic a little bit, but this entire realm of theater or acting, is there a general kind of moral stance on this in terms of whether it's dangerous, whether it's good, you know, does it have positive aspects?
It is dangerous. And we see it. All these people in Hollywood, how real is any part of their life? How solid? You read these headlines in the magazines. This famous actress has found true love. And a month later, it's like, and you know, true love, not in Hollywood. In Hollywood, you have Hollywood love.
Right.
There's a famous story from back from the shtetl. There was this guy in a town who was known as Yossel the Fool. But the most important governing whatever guy, some very important guy was coming to town, and everybody was talking and everybody was nervous, and who's going to represent the community? And Yossel the Fool says, I'll talk to him. They said, what are you going to talk to him about? He says, I'll talk to him. He approaches this very important guy and he says, hello, welcome to the community. The guy says, who are you? He says, who am I? You know the guy who invented the wheel? He says, why, are you related to him? He says, no. He said, so who are you? He says, you know the guy who owns all the property, all the wood, all the forests all around Kiev? He says, yes. Are you related to him? He says, no. And he does this like 4 or 5 times, and finally the guy says, but who are you? He says, who am I? I'm Yossel the Fool. But in the meantime, he had a 20-minute conversation that everybody else was afraid to have.
Right.
So that's called boasting.
I see.
No attempt at deception.
So because you bring this up in, I guess, the way of, in the way of this anecdote, I want to get, before we get to the end of this, to humor, because humor would seem to be a very complicated topic in the sense that it's not mean-spirited, but it does often rely on saying things that people know not to be true. It's obviously related to idle talk and frivolity, but you know, as your anecdote just shows, and as you know, if anyone watches your YouTube videos, they can say it can also be a very effective teaching tool. So I want to get to the issue of humor in a little bit, but before we get there, I'd like to first just go through these other elements. I think we've spent a fair amount of time on scoffing and boasting, but frivolity and idle talk. I like to focus on these for a second, just because they seem to be, in a way, of a sort of a different quality or a different manifestation of this underlying element. And for starters, I'd like to maybe understand just what is so bad about frivolity. Just what is so bad about idle talk, right? I mean, it's just talk. Doesn't hurt anybody. It's just, you may be wasting some time, but why is this? What's the big deal? What's how does frivolity get on the same list as anger or any of these other really negative
things? Yeah, how does it compare to lust?
Exactly.
So here's again, a little bit of a background. What does it mean that certain people are more like fire and some people are more like water? What does it mean that they tend in that direction? It's not that they're programmed to that behavior. It's that they find the most pleasure in that behavior. So the person who is the element of fire, it's because that gives them the most pleasure. Anybody can boast, and most people do. So, at some point in their life, they boast. That's not an airhead. That's not a person who is governed by the element of water, of air. They just dip into it once in a while. Anybody can be arrogant on occasion, and everybody has lust. The question is, if you had to choose your pleasure, where do you find the greatest amount of pleasure? The arrogant person finds the greatest pleasure in feeling superior, putting down others. It gives him pleasure. It gives him pleasure to get angry. When he is angry, he is at his best.
Right. Some people say people are happiest when they're sad, or people are happiest being angry.
Yes, yes. So there are people who find their greatest pleasure is in talking nonsense, in idle talk. Stay away from any substantive subject.
Right.
Don't get me involved in anything heavy or real. Let's just play. And that gives them the greatest pleasure.
Right. So before we get on to discussing what's so wrong with that, I want to just circle back then to the element of water, just to clarify, because we're talking about all these elements, saying whatever is kind of listed associated with them is something that they take most pleasure in. But it seems that the element of water, what it's associated with, at least in this text, is the appetite for pleasures is what emanates from the element of water. So how does that map to, are you taking the most pleasure in pleasure, or what is that? What does it mean to take pleasure in pleasure? Or is there some other way that we have to understand that?
Oh, that's a good way to put it. Pleasure for the sake of pleasure.
Got it.
Now, some people will study and master a subject and get a lot of pleasure. But what they did was master a subject.
Right.
Here, the person is looking for pleasure for the sake of pleasure and ends up with pleasure.
I guess one could ask what's so bad about that as well, but
yes.
We will.
Well, it leads to narcissism, but that's another subject.
Right.
Now, the problem with pleasure, the water pleasure, is that for some strange reason, where does a human being find pleasure? Physically, not ideological pleasure. Yeah. Human beings find pleasure in animals, in vegetables and in minerals, all of them inferior to himself. So the pursuit of pleasure always takes us down below our own standard, below our own level, because the human being is the highest of all creations. And yet, what am I drawn to? Where do I find pleasure? In things that are not even equal to me. To find pleasure in a vegetable. My favorite vegetable. Oh, I love this vegetable. It's so degrading. What are you doing? You're almost like begging the vegetable to give you some pleasure. You're on your hands and knees, please. It's so humiliating. So that's what he's saying, that the pursuit of pleasure is related to the element of water that always seeks the lowest level.
Right. So we're talking mostly then about physical pleasures. We're not talking about, like you said, the pleasure of, mastering some important topic or ability, or, any sort of pleasure that might come from
kindness,
service to others. That we're talking about physical pleasures primarily, and things that are associated with
the animal soul,
let's say.
Right? The pleasures of the animal soul.
Right. Okay. So that would seem to be what's so bad about these water people. What is so bad about the idle talk? Okay. So he finds the most pleasure when he's not being serious.
In other words, his greatest pleasure is avoiding reality.
And I can see how that might make the person unproductive, or, not useful or not reliable, but why is this, what is so sinful about that? Why? It's not.
None of these things are sinful.
Got it. But it is a negative character aspect.
Yes. And all of them can be used for the good.
That's an interesting thread that I want to pursue, because
like humor, as you were saying before.
Yes. So let's talk about the flip side of these negative characteristics, which is, okay, can we name, let's say, and unpack the positive traits or actions corresponding to frivolity, scoffing, boasting, idle talk, or the positive qualities that might emanate from this element of air more generally?
Let's try anyway. For example, let's go back to the water thing.
Right.
Where does the pleasure that an adult has playing with a child, where does that pleasure come from? From the element of water. Because again, the child is smaller, inferior to the adult, and yet the adult gets pleasure from the child. That comes from the ability to go down and find pleasure. Whereas another example used in Chassidus is, why do we love miniatures? What is this fascination with miniatures? Like a miniature Statue of Liberty. Why not get a big one?
Right.
No, the little ones are so cute.
People love tiny dogs.
Tiny dogs, yeah. So this element of downward motion introduces a certain kind of humility on the positive side of it. That you can lower yourself and get pleasure from something not as great as you. Whereas arrogance would never permit that. The arrogant person can't get down on his hands and knees and play with a baby. It's beneath his dignity.
So what are the positive aspects that we might associate with air, with this instability, or with not inability to commit, not wanting to be serious? What's the upside of frivolity?
The upside of it is non-judgmental, tolerance. I can go with whatever it is you want to go with, even though it's not my direction. So I can tolerate, I can cooperate, I can join you in your direction, even though it's not my direction. Now, there's another, I don't know why the Rebbe doesn't mention it, but another element of the air is a person easily influenced. I'm not sure how to, what the one word description for that would be. He just goes with whatever's popular. He can't go against the trend or against the tide. He goes with whatever is going.
Right.
So he's a total follower.
Right.
But on the other hand, the positive side of that is non-judgmental. He can cooperate. He can participate. He's flexible. Not that that gives him the greatest pleasure.
Right. And that might have going with the flow, we could see how it can have positive or negative aspects, right? If the flow is something you're not supposed to be doing, but you're, good-natured person who's willing to go along to get along, this can create problems for you, obviously. What about the idea of, let's say, optimism or lightheartedness or good cheer? This is a really bad situation. If you wanted to, bring it maybe back to the title of this of this session, cynical or realistic. If anybody objectively looking around at the situation would say, you know what, this is a tough spot. This is not so good. This is bad. But you're the guy who says, you know what, I'm gonna kind of abstract away from that reality, or I'm gonna just sort of ignore it, and I'm gonna be optimistic and think, if it's bad, so what? It must be able to get better. Or I'm just going to, be the person on the team who motivates everyone by, never giving up, even though not giving up, given the circumstances, might be a crazy thing to do. Is that ever considered actually a positive quality, or is that, because it falls into the realm of possibly self-deception and maybe even deception of others, we're getting into problems?
I'm not sure you can call it deception. Is the pessimist being unrealistic, or is the optimist being unrealistic?
Well, I mean,
That's what you ask.
you might say both, right? The pessimists views things as worse than they are. The optimists views things as better than they are. And none of them is fully attuned to, let's say, the reality of reality.
Well, yeah, okay. So that would fall under the category of air. I just don't want to deal with reality. But the optimist isn't necessarily living in denial. He knows the problem. It doesn't drag him down. The pessimist, on the other hand, knows that there's good news, but it gives him no pleasure.
Right.
So he's not living in denial. He's just choosing what he wants to celebrate, the good news or the bad news.
Right.
So obviously, pessimism would come from the element of earth.
Right.
It's heavy. It's gloomy, lifeless. But where would optimism come from?
You would think fire based on what you've just said.
But the Rebbe doesn't mention it.
Right. So I guess we can distinguish between a form of optimism that, you might associate more with fire, which is, okay, I see the situation, but I choose sort of an upward path in terms of what I want to focus on or emphasize, and an optimism that comes from, pure frivolity, right? I don't really care what the real situation is. I want to live in my own reality, and it's more comfortable for me to think that things are going well.
So where would ambition come from? You have the ambitious type.
Right.
Definitely from fire.
Which is different probably from the optimistic type.
It is different, yes. I think optimism in the human soul exists where there is less earth. The less earth, the more optimistic. But it's not true optimism. True optimism comes from the godly soul.
Mm-hmm. Which is not one of these physical elements at all.
Right. But ambition, the element of fire, or the way fire is described, physical fire, it rises, which means it wants to separate from what holds it down. It resents being held down. A person who's ambitious has two instincts. One is, what I have is not acceptable. That's the rejection of the status quo.
Right.
In place of that, I want something bigger, better, richer, whatever. So I'm ambitious. So ambition has these two sides to it. Discontent, but ambitious about the future.
Right. So both optimistic but unsatisfied.
Right.
So let's take it back to. So let's take it back to idle talk. What is, we're talking because this is explicitly listed in the list of negative traits here associated with the element of air. So what is so negative about idle talk? I mean, maybe there's a positive aspect to it as well, but clearly there's at least some kind of it that's unequivocally bad.
But again, it's bad if that's your trait,
Right.
not just an occasional indulgence.
Right.
If that's where your greatest pleasure comes from, you're in trouble. If that's what gives you the most pleasure, you're not going anywhere in your life. So it's bad news for your family, it's bad news for your children, it's bad news for everyone associated with you.
So is that then in a sense related to, I guess, a lack of responsibility, that you're taking pleasure in things that are just sort of not useful, I guess?
The pleasure is in the irresponsibility of it.
Right.
That is the pleasure.
I see. So why are these things so common? I mean, it seems like, especially at shul, you can walk around and people are kibitzing all the time, and it's, this is maybe the definition of idle chatter. Why isn't there more of a recognition or widespread acceptance that this is bad, or this might be as inappropriate as anger? No one wants to get angry in public, but gossip, hey, small talk, right? This is, if somebody doesn't do that, it's considered weird. So why is that? Why are we, I guess, in our cultural norms, at least of today, so attuned to the one, but so oblivious of the other?
Well, it's very hard to engage in idle talk and lashon hara when you're alone.
Right.
It only works.
Now that we have Zoom, maybe, but
yeah, right. So talking to yourself, bad-mouthing somebody is no fun. But here again is the problem. Everybody in shul indulges in idle talk. That's not the same as the class clown. That's the only thing he can do.
right.
That guy's in trouble. So if that is his dominant feature, the air is his dominant element, that's a problem. People want to indulge once in a while, it's tolerable because it's not a sin.
Right, but tolerable.
In the olden days, people who wanted to work at self-improvement would take on fasts. And sometimes it was called a speech fast, where for 24 hours he will not speak at all, just to discipline the faculty of speech. So that when you say something, it should be meaningful, it should be purposeful, it should be true, and it should be productive. So in the olden days, they did pay more attention to the quality of speech. But I think, with modern technology, where everyone can offer an opinion on any subject, it's a little out of control.
Right. And so this reminds me of, I guess, a recent book, and I don't know what you might call it. It's philosophy or maybe social commentary. And you'll have to excuse me for quoting the title, but the title of the book is On Bullshit. And it's sort of dealing with this phenomena that there's a sort of talk, or there's a way of interacting with each other that is inherently somewhat frivolous, somewhat dishonest, but widely accepted. And it's this, and it seems, as you say, with social media and things of this nature, contentless interaction, meaningless words become, or worse, disingenuous interaction, right? Oh, it's more pictures of my friend's baby on Facebook, let me like those, right? Just because, or hey, my friend posted this, so I feel obligated to like it, and it sort of loses all meaning. Is there something more, even if you just engage in that, it's not your major source of pleasure in life, but is there something more insidious about when that becomes so pervasive? So even though nobody, in terms of how much they as an individual are engaging in that, maybe crossing the line into sin, as a society perhaps, or collectively, the overall acceptance or tolerance or promotion of this could be bad. I guess just what are your thoughts on that?
I would blame that on Madison Avenue more even than Hollywood. Advertisements, the brilliance, the brain power that goes into creating advertisements, which are absolute lies, disinformation, meant to tempt you with falsehoods to get you to buy a product that isn't anything they claim it is. And yet, that's an art. It's a respected art.
All right, so we got problems for the actors. Now we have problems for the advertising people as well.
Yeah. So truth in advertisement, it doesn't exist. I mean, the whole thing with advertisement is how you can create a false impression. And the more false and the more successful the impression, the more brilliant you are, and you get bigger bucks for it.
Right.
So it has become a cultural habit. Make it sound good. Doesn't have to be true. And if you can do that, you're a genius. It's not good.
I mean, isn't there something in a way that crosses the line into sin about this? I mean, even if you're not, you don't take that much pleasure in it. Maybe you say, well, look, we have to do this because everybody else does it. Everybody else lies about how good their car is. We want people to buy our cars. We can't just tell the truth and then our car looks worse. We have to, I don't even want to, but I'm doing it. But, so it seems like a fraught area in terms of the spectrum along which, they're saying things that you don't believe, maybe to compliment someone or to avoid embarrassing them. Then they're saying it because you don't believe it because you feel like you don't have a choice. Then they're saying it and you don't believe it because, all the way on the other spectrum is because you're actively trying to deceive someone. So where do we draw the line, or can we draw a line?
It does border on some, it does border on crime. But I remember in the olden days, advertisements would boast about the virtues and the advantages of the product. They would say, this car will last for years. If it didn't, you could sue the company. Maybe not successfully, but you had grounds. The companies didn't like that. So the advertisements became more and more vague and disembodied. It doesn't claim anything about the superiority of the product. It just says, if you're looking for love, drive this car, which means absolutely nothing, but it's subliminal, or it's become more deceptive and become more dishonest by not even claiming any virtues. Nothing is said about the product, except that the advertisement looks so good and it's funny and catchy and it's got a tune. What about the product? Well, I didn't say it was a good product.
So somehow, by not making any claims at all, one might say, well, how could you be more dishonest if you're not saying that the product does anything, right? If you say the product does something and it doesn't, okay, that's dishonesty. But if you just say, hey, I'm not going to tell you this product is actually going to work. I'm just going to say cool people own it and let you make your own decision. How is that really more dishonest?
Right. So here's where it borders on sin, because it is a sin to put a stumbling block before a blind man. Right? The guy's blind, and you want to have a little fun. So you're watching him walk down the street, and you put a cinder block right in his path, and he's going to trip over it, and you're going to have a good laugh, and you're going to have fun. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to take advantage of a person's blindness. And the same is true with selling a product to a naive buyer, taking advantage of his blindness or naivete. That's not allowed. That's called gnevas das. You're stealing by using his ignorance against him. You're not allowed to do that. It is a definite evil, sinful, criminal act. So to whitewash that and make it sound innocent, and it's not. And so truth in advertisement really should be enforced.
And so just for the record, which of the four elements would that behavior of placing a stumbling block in front of the blind man emanate from?
Again, it doesn't, because it's a sin.
I see.
It's not a nature in a person. It's a misbehavior. So advertisement is not a character in the human makeup.
Right.
It's just an evil scheme.
Sure. But there must be some sort of psychological, there must be something in the people who do it that makes them be the people who want to do that versus the people who don't. Is there any way to connect these actions to, elements of people's nature?
Or is there any one of the four that is more likely to go into that misbehavior?
Well, yeah, maybe it's a combination. I don't know how.
Arrogance. I'm smarter than you, and I'm going to take advantage because you're an idiot, and I can get you to buy anything. I can outsmart you, I can trip you up, I can take advantage. The arrogant person is more likely to do that. It is the rich taking advantage of the poor.
Right. So we've covered a lot of ground, but before we, I guess, finalize everything, I do want to come back to the subject of humor, because humor is a very broad-ranging topic. It certainly is associated with this idea of idle talk or frivolity. Some humor is also malicious, but humor can also be very valuable in terms of relieving people's stress or anxiety, letting them avoid reality. If, in some ways, I mean, everyone needs to avoid reality at some point, right? Or have some escapism to soothe their hardships that they may be going through. And also as a teaching tool, right? Which it's a tool that you very, very commonly employ to make the teaching more effective. So I guess let's talk about humor a little bit, where it fits into these four elements, and also perhaps what is it about humor? What is it about injecting something funny or some laughter into teaching that makes it more effective? You might think, hey, the more focused the people are, the better they're going to learn. But no, you throw in a joke, that increases. You talk about something else that's only tangentially related, you get a laugh, somehow that increases the effectiveness of the teaching. Why is that? So I know that's a kind of a broad canvas, but the intention is to let you answer it in an open-ended way, because you're obviously knowledgeable on this topic.
It's a very important topic, by the way, really. So a few things. First of all, good humor instead of bathroom humor is not just making people laugh and distracting them from their problems. Really good humor allows you to laugh at your problem. That is healthy. So it's not a denial. It's not an ignoring of the reality. It's the ability to laugh at your problem. That's life-saving. Secondly, all frivolity, all jesting is forbidden, the Talmud says, except making fun of idols. Because we find even in the Torah itself, in Tehillim, in the Psalms, King David mocks the idols. They have eyes that don't see, a nose that doesn't breathe, right? What that tells us, the most valuable part of humor is where you can present the falsehood or the evil in a way that lets you recognize it without getting intimidated. It's an art. And art is a way of seeing something that the average person doesn't see, but once you point it out, it enlightens. When a person jokes about his own arrogance or his own ineptness, makes fun of his own failings, it is a painless way of facing your own faults, weaknesses, vulnerabilities. So you want to show a person how vulnerable he is. If you just do it straight up, you hurt him and you scare him. And it does not help him improve because now he's intimidated. So harsh criticism very, very seldom does any good in fixing the problem that you're criticizing. But if you can present it in a safe way so that the person won't withdraw and close and shut down, that is a very helpful and useful part of humor. The very wise Hasidic teachers had an incredibly good sense of humor.
I sense a joke coming up already.
I'm trying to think of one, but
I'm not gonna. If you don't have one, it's okay. I don't want to put you on the spot.
yeah,
Just I see an amusing story in our near future.
yeah. No, I'm just remembering how enjoyable they were. These very serious teachers who were very disciplined in their own lives and never indulged in anything pointless or frivolous, and yet they would come out with these crack up funny analogies or whatever it is, and it was always so to the point. It was always so revealing, and that's good humor. So the positive use of humor is the ability to face reality, not avoid it, but face it in a way that doesn't scare you off. On the contrary, it allows you to take the responsibility without being scarred by it. I think that's the best word for it. Harsh criticism may help a person behave better, but it'll leave a scar. And that's not right. With humor, you get the same thing accomplished, but no scars.
Well, let's unpack that maybe a little bit, because if you're talking about humor as a way to laugh at your own problems and therefore acknowledge them, but in a non-damaging or non-scarring way, that would seem to be a very different thing than using humor to point out somebody else's problems. And many people think that making a joke or making light of somebody else's issues or problems, or bringing to light those things through humor, can actually be more malicious or more damaging, even if it's not intended to be malicious, more hurtful than addressing it straight on. So how do we? It would seem that there's the possibility that the humor can diffuse the situation, but there's also the possibility that the humor makes it just that much more stinging, whether it's because it's memorable or because it heightens the appearance of the ridiculousness. So how do we understand these two different possibilities for the fact that humor makes light of these issues?
Somebody made this comment or observation. Since Johnny Carson retired, humor has become vicious. It's not funny anymore. It's meant to hurt. It's meant to degrade. You don't find any real humor anymore other than put down. It's a terrible development and very sad. So humor has been hijacked and is now used as a weapon. It's nasty. You're right. Let me give you a good example. This chassid who passed away a couple of years ago, he was 101 years old. And his sense of humor was, but always meaningful. So one day he wakes up, he's 100 years old, and he says to his family, I had a dream. Angels came and told me that it's time for me to leave this earth because there's a shortage of teachers and mentors in the next world. I said, how could that be? All the great teachers and all the great mentors. There's a shortage of teachers in heaven? And they said, no, we're not talking about heaven. We need you in hell. And he cracks himself up laughing. Not in Gan Eden, in Gehenna. I was invited to be a teacher in hell. And he cracks himself up. What was he doing? He was making peace with the fact that he might not go to heaven. he might go to hell. So should that scare him, intimidate him, crush him? You go to hell, you go to hell, you know? We've survived worse things than that.
You say so. I mean, that seems pretty bad. Maybe that's, I don't know. Maybe that's the optimistic aspect of avoiding the full implications of reality.
Or the humility. Yeah, you know, if I go to hell, yeah, kind of makes sense. It's like, well, I'm going to hell? Well, where do you think you're going? Don't be shocked. You're a human being. You did some pretty bad things. Yeah, you go to hell. Not for the entire 12 months. You are not the worst of the worst, but don't be surprised if you go to hell. Who do you think you are?
Right.
So it's a way of introducing his own humility and giving a voice to it without getting depressed and morbid.
And so let's tie this back to the teaching tool, right? Because even this story that you just told, there's a punchline. And somehow that's supposed to illustrate or elucidate the point that we've been making. How and why does humor work that way? How can it be that, in sort of veering off topic and going into an anecdote not directly related to, the lesson at hand, why is that such an effective tool for instruction, actually?
It goes back again to pleasure. Humor has a certain pleasure. If that's the only pleasure you enjoy in life, then you're an airhead. But the pleasure that is there kind of softens the rough edges. It gives you a little padding when you want to face a distasteful fact or a disappointing fact, and you want to kind of buffer it so that it doesn't take a chunk out of you and leave you with a scar. So what do? You wrap the whole subject with a little pleasure, the pleasure of the humor in it. So it's really the pleasure that makes it go down easy without leaving scars. And that's how we criticize ourselves. How is it that I can call myself all sorts of names and admit to all sorts of misbehavior and failures, and it doesn't hurt? Somebody else would say exactly the same thing about me, and he would be my enemy forever. I would hate him. I would want to kill him. Why? I just said the same thing. It's like a person says to his friend, I'm such a klutz. And a friend says, yeah, that's it. You're not my friend anymore.
Right.
Well, I just agreed with you. Finally, you were right about something. What's wrong with that?
Exactly.
And yet you hate it. It's because when you look at your own faults, the fault is wrapped in layers of pleasure. The pleasure of acceptance, self-acceptance. Yes, I may be guilty of all of that, but I'm still valid. I'm still a useful human being. I can still be good for other things. But when anybody else criticizes me, then the message is you're good for nothing. You might as well not even be here. Oh, that hurts. So if you're really my best friend and you say, you're being so arrogant, I love it. It's nice when you have a friend who can talk so open, honest, direct, because you know that even after seeing your arrogance, your friend still is your friend, because he knows you're a valid human being. You really should exist. The world would not be better off without you. Those are the layers of pleasure that protect you from the damage of criticism.
Right.
So before you criticize somebody, make sure that they know that you think they're valid human beings. So valid that even with this fault, you're still lovable. That's what you do for yourself. Do it for others too. So the humor is like a layer of pleasure that absorbs the harshness of the criticism, and it leaves no scars.
So it helps you face the reality of the lesson, so to speak.
Without shock. Because if you go into shock, then you don't get the lesson.
Right. Well, this has been, I think, a fascinating and wide-ranging conversation. Any final thoughts on the element of air, the traits associated with it, and how that fits into, our understanding of life or morality that you want to leave people with as a final thought?
As an introduction to Tanya, since it's the first chapter of Tanya, it sets up the model. We are not going to talk about your sins, and we're not going to talk about your evil inclination. That should not be a topic of conversation. Evil is not acceptable. Sin is to be avoided. Take it off the agenda. We're not going to talk about it. There's something more interesting, more elegant to worry about. We have a much more noble war to conduct. And we don't live on the precipice. Any moment you're going to sin. You've got an evil inclination. You're tempted to sin all the time. Watch it. That's degrading. It's putting the human being at a very inelegant position. The Tanya came along and said, that should not be your concern. Sin is off the agenda. Don't do it. Now, can we talk about something meaningful?
Right.
What is more meaningful? The struggle between a godly soul and a human soul. Human, not sinful. And so none of these traits that describe human nature have a sin associated. There's no crime here. Human beings don't commit crimes. But human beings have a challenge. You want to merely be a human being, or do you want to be godly? Because you have the option. So here's really the ultimate conclusion. The difference between a human being and everything else in creation, including angels. The human being is the only creation that doesn't like how it's created. A human being objects to being human. Makes it qualitatively different from the animal. The animal has no objections to being an animal. The cow would not rather be anything else other than a cow. And it goes about being a cow all the time. Never gets distracted. Never goes off and says, yeah, today I think I'll be a lion. No. It's a cow, and it does cow thing all the time because it's content. And the lion is content to be a lion. It doesn't want to be a kitten. And the kitten doesn't want to be a lion. And every animal is content being an animal. It doesn't want to be a vegetable. And it doesn't want to be a human being. The mineral is perfectly happy being a mineral. Salt never complains, never goes bad. never gives up. It's salt. The vegetable has no complaints. It loves being a flower. It loves being a plant. It loves being a tree. Only the human being is frustrated. Only the human being gets anxious. Not about survival, about existence. Why am I here? Don't torture yourself. You're here. Enjoy it. No, why am I here? Why do you do this to yourself? The question, why am I here, really means I'm not content being what I am. I'm not content being what I was given. I have to contribute something of my own. So I was created human. Well, then I'm not interested. What am I creating? So the human being is never content being human. That's a compliment to the human being. But then the obvious question is, if you're not content being a human, what's your option? So some people say, I'll become an animal. I'll run like a deer. I'll jump like a kangaroo. I'll swim like a fish. I'll fly through the air like a bird. It's kind of pathetic. The bird will always fly better than you. The fish will always swim better than you. The deer will always run faster than you. So becoming an animal doesn't do it for you. Then what is your option? The only option is to become godly. And that's what the Torah is all about. The Torah comes and says, I know you're looking to be something more than human. Well, here's a plan. Follow these instructions and you will become more than human. You will become a partner in creation rather than just a piece of creation. That's what's wrong with the human soul. It gets too hung up on what it already is. Arrogance, anger, passions. That's just who you were created. What have you introduced? What have you added to the mix? Answer is a mitzvah. A mitzvah takes you beyond human because there isn't a single mitzvah that you really need to do. Not one. Do you need to eat matzah on Pesach? No. I can eat matzah anytime or never eat matzah at all. You need to put on tefillin? That would be weird. I need leather boxes on me? No, you don't need it. You need to give charity? No. The poor guy needs to get charity. You don't need to give it. So every mitzvah takes you beyond your own instinct and need. It takes you into a different reality. God's need. Wow. And it's not that complicated. So a little more respect for the human being. We're not here constantly struggling to avoid sin. We're not that bad. And even if we are, we don't have to admit it.
There you go. A little optimism and perhaps not evidence of reality, but making it a little easier to bear to finish off this lesson here.
Yes. And that's, I think, the beginning of Tanya. Don't grovel. Don't live in the gutter where any moment now you might commit adultery or kill somebody. Come on, stop. The average human being is better than that. So what's the challenge for the average human being? The challenge is, don't just be decent, be godly. The struggle now is between a good human being and a godly being. Much more elegant. much more respectful of the human condition.
Perfect. Well, I don't
Okay.
think there's much more to add to that. I want to thank you, Rabbi Friedman, for the very enlightening discussion. And yeah, I want to thank you, Rabbi Vogel, for helping organize all this. And I hope this was educational for everybody watching. Certainly, I feel like I learned a lot. And hopefully maybe a little humorous and enjoyable as well.
Zachary, thank you very much. That was illuminating, and that was very, very enlightening and humorous. Thank you very much for taking out from your time from your busy day. And Rabbi Friedman, thank you always for sharing all that wisdom gained from many, many years of teaching, inspiring many thousands of people over probably 50 years. I just want to add, we can perhaps tie this in with the parsha of the week, which talks about each Jew giving a half shekel, not a complete shekel. The Rebbe explains how this illustrates how an individual, a human being, is only half, not complete, always lacking, always wanting more to fulfill itself and to fulfill its role in completing an imperfect world, or making better an imperfect world which God has created. So thank you all again. Zachary, thank you. Rabbi Friedman, thank you.
And I hope that people notice that the way Zachary was attacking the text, that's called learning. You know, people could read it and, you know, skim over it and oh yeah, this comes from here, that comes from there. That's not called learning. You stop at each word and say, what exactly is this? Why is it here? Why does it belong to this category? And what else is it saying? That's called learning. Of course, it would take you forever to finish your Tanya if you went that way, but
Maybe that's the point.
yes.
Exactly. It's like the Rebbe would say, it's a good beginning, and please God, we should meet again many occasions, both virtually and please God, very soon physically. Zachary, thanks again. Rabbi Friedman, thanks again. Have a wonderful evening. Have a wonderful afternoon, and hope to see you again soon. Take care.
Only good news for all of us.